Welcome to Savage Minds. I'm your host, Julian Vigo. Today's guest is Kheriaty, MD, a physician specializing in psychiatry and author of 3 books, including most recently, The New Abnormal, The Rise of the Biomedical Security State, published in 2022. He is a fellow and director of the program in bioethics and American democracy at the Ethics and Public Policy Center and a senior scholar and fellow at the Brownstone Institute. I welcome Kheriaty to Savage Minds. I was at the public library quite a bit these weeks, and they had a special intervention, guest speakers talking about fascism in Italy. There are some psychologists who are going to be lecturing on childhood bullying. And I'm going to go, and perhaps they might feel that I'm adult bullying them, but I'm going to ask them why we're not talking about the elephant in the room here. Because one thing that's happened in many countries across the EU is governments here have offered what they call in Italy the bonus psicologo. But we're not going to say why we're offering this money to you, because it's just a coincidence everyone needs a psychologist because of no reason. And if lockdown weren't bad enough, even though the Great Barrington Declaration and others have been saying for years this was not the right thing to do, we've now entered into this other territory, which is not that far afoot, but masks, yes, no, do they work, what kind, then the vaccines and the boosters. Can you talk a bit about how you entered into this scenario?
Well, so for most of my career, 15 years plus, I was a professor at the School of Medicine at the University of California in Irvine, where I also directed the program in medical ethics. So I chaired the ethics committee in the hospital. I also chaired the ethics committee at the California Department of State Hospitals, the state psychiatric hospital system. And as a medical ethicist, when the lockdowns continued for a prolonged period of time, I began to get worried. And so my first foray was actually precisely the issue you just mentioned, which was the collateral mental health harms of COVID. So this was back in August of 2020. I published my first sort of critique of our COVID public policy, an article called The Other Pandemic in a journal called Public Discourse. And the other pandemic was referring to the lockdown mental health harms that I was seeing both in my psychiatric clinic, but also we were seeing emerging evidence over the summer of 2020 of these massive harms. And just to give you a quick sketch of what that looked like, this was a study from our own CDC, ironically, in June of 2020, showing that anxiety disorders had quadrupled as compared to the same month 1 year prior during the lockdowns. Depressive disorders had tripled. 1 in 10 Americans was reporting serious suicidal ideation, suicidal thoughts, not at any point during their lifetime, but in the last 30 days during the month of June 2020. And if you broke that already sort of appalling number down by age, among 18 to 24-year-olds, university-aged students and so forth, young adults, that number was 24%. 1 in 4 Americans during the month of June 2020 had seriously considered suicide after prolonged lockdowns and school closures. And we also had data that I cited in that article from Britain as well, showing very similar trends. And I could not understand why this was not part of the public conversation. I could not understand why no one was talking about these collateral harms. I think it was either shortly before or shortly after the publication of that piece that the Great Barrington Declaration was published. So I was edified to see, my now friends, Jay Bhattacharya and Martin Kulldorff, also critiquing the lockdown policies. But they were sort of lone voices. And as we now know, they were being subjected to government-sponsored censorship and government-sponsored smear campaigns, actually, to try to silence what prior to the pandemic would have been mainstream conventional public health wisdom on how to manage a respiratory virus with focused protection. And my concerns about our policies continued the following year with vaccine mandates. And so I published a piece in the Wall Street Journal in August of 2021 when my own institution was considering a vaccine mandate. And that was called, the title of that article was University Vaccine Mandates Violate Medical Ethics. And I couldn't understand why there was no public debate or discussion or concern about mandates that were violating the principle of informed consent, because this is one of the central principles of 21st century medical ethics. This is a basic principle that I taught in, lecture 2 of the required ethics course that I taught to all medical students every year. This is the principle first articulated in the Nuremberg Code in the wake of the Nazi doctor trials at Nuremberg, that was designed precisely to prevent the kind of abuses that we saw Nazi medicine fall into during World War II, and actually even prior to World War II. And we were steamrolling this principle of informed consent, that an adult of sound mind should be able to make a decision after getting adequate information about risks and benefits and alternatives to a proposed treatment or medical intervention. They should be able to make a free and uncoerced decision to either accept that intervention or to decline it, and to make the same decision on behalf of their children who are not yet old enough to consent. The university went ahead and promulgated their vaccine mandate. And at that point, after speaking publicly about this and putting a stake in the ground publicly on the ethics of this, I decided it was important to try to practice what I was preaching, so to speak. That I couldn't, with any credibility, stand up in the lecture hall or in the seminar room in front of medical students and talk about this and other ethical principles that were important. I couldn't talk about moral courage and integrity and doing the right thing, under pressure, if I hadn't tried in my position to do something about this unjust mandate. So, long story short, I filed a lawsuit in federal court against the University of California, challenging their vaccine mandate on the grounds that it was violating the U.S. Constitution. And before the judge made a ruling in that case, the university fired me.
On what basis were you fired?
I was fired for alleged noncompliance with that same mandate that I was challenging in federal court, alleged noncompliance with the vaccine mandate. I had filed a lawsuit on behalf of people with natural immunity like me who had recovered from COVID. And the science already at that point clearly showed that natural immunity was superior to vaccine immunity. For the sake of my legal argument, it just had to be equal to vaccine immunity. So I argued I was being unjustly discriminated against for having that particular form of immunity. And that the university, I noted also that the university had also twice rejected my medical exemption that was signed by my physician. And so, they fired me, allegedly under the very policy that I was arguing was both unethical and illegal. So I found myself in 2022 kind of right in the middle of the debates about what happened to us during COVID, and trying to figure out how medicine and public health and public policy had gone so drastically wrong and had embraced policies that not only failed to achieve their public health purpose, but did enormous collateral harms. And yet, even as evidence of those harms mounted, those policies remained in place. And institutions like the one I had previously worked for just continued to double down on those failed policies. And I became convinced that the reason for that is that our response to COVID, in the end, had little to do with public health and more to do with economic and other political interests that were at work and that were driving policies in a specific direction.
You don't say. I was livid because they scared the bejesus out of all of us here in Italy. And
that's right.
I lived in a condominium. We were the only people in the condominium, aside from one other person under the age of 80. No exaggeration. Yeah. There were nightly festivities in everyone's house. There we were, worried about We didn't see anyone. We did not see anyone for over a year. We were not allowed to go out of certain parts of the area where we lived, or the region, or the province, etc., etc. And we had to hear nightly parties from these octogenarians.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
we're like, wait a second, something isn't squaring here yet. But I was still in that phase. In those first 2 weeks, I was still like, well, let's just see. I was willing to give that Kierkegaardian leap of faith, yes, and just go with it. But around that time, I found out that the government's priorities were, I'm not joking, this really killed me. They would put out news info on all the various news sources saying when people could go to their second house and when they could see their calcio games, their football games again.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, this is weird. Meanwhile, Pornhub had given all the men in Italy free subscriptions, right? Because men need their porn. But not a word was said. And as a journalist, I was covering the reality that I saw very fast on the ground, that it was women, including women doctors, having to say, I have to stay at home and take care of the kids and do this, what they call here, didactica a distanza, the homeschooling nonsense that was proven to be a failure here as in everywhere else, right?
Yeah, right.
Because
disastrous.
Oh, it was also ridiculously stupid in the sense of who sat down there at the table and thought, these people are going to magically do what Einstein could not do, and they're going to reproduce time and space and do it all. Like, did no one think about the fact that there were people like me who I didn't sleep or eat for 2 years? I was really I slept very little. I ate one meal a day. I mean, great. I'm not obese as a result, but I think I might have starved myself at certain points of these lockdowns. It was really scary for people like myself who were freelancers. We were not covered by anything. We were, because I had just moved to Italy, that was my bonus for moving to Italy. Well, I'm sorry, you didn't make your income last year here. So we were eligible for nothing. Meanwhile, we went out to shop. Once a week I would go out. And I was in the U.S. Army. I knew all about what they called in the time, MOP 4, this whole decontamination method that you use if you are in some kind of chemical warfare. And I was all like, okay, I'll do this, because they were making us think that this was the bloody plague. It wasn't.
Yeah, that's right.
And I saw very, very quickly the demographic. We saw that children weren't dying. We saw that there was no reason to be locking society up. And yet we'd go to the shop, we'd be stopped by the police or the carabinieri here, which are like the French gendarmes. And every time I shopped, it was a 50-50 chance that I'd be stopped. We had to print out forms here to leave. I mean, this makes the Stasi look like hippies, some of what we went through here.
Yeah, it's important to have that historical perspective. You mentioned Italian fascism, at the beginning, but the lockdowns created a regime and more than just a novel, previously untested, drastic method of trying to control a respiratory virus, that the lockdowns were actually a new paradigm of governance. And it was a paradigm of governance that went way beyond anything that the Italian fascists ever dreamed of doing in terms of micro controlling, invasively controlling the minutia of everyday life. How far away from someone are you allowed to stand? When are you allowed to go out of your home? The totalitarian regimes of the past never exercised that level of social control. The city of London, we saw people giving up civil liberties that were not relinquished by the citizens of London during the German bombing of the city in World War II. They had curfews there, but they never did anything close to locking down or forcing people underground for the sake of their health and safety. So that historical perspective is very, very important to try to understand and wrap your head around what's going on.
The problem I'm facing, Aaron, is that I am going to go to that library event next week that's on bullying. Wasn't that avant-garde 10 years ago? But anyways, I'm going to show up and I'm going to be that bad person that's going to talk about the elephant in the room, because I talk to people all the time here. Nobody talks about it. And I don't know if you remember or have seen, in fact, the Stepford Wives, but I use the end scene where Catherine Ross is pushing the push cart in the supermarket and staring almost
Yeah.
hypnotized forward.
Yeah.
But that's
Right.
what I think. I think we're living the Stepford Wives post-lockdown. And I'm like, I feel constantly, I could just refer this to film after film, like the kid in The Sixth Sense, where I see dead bodies everywhere. But I want to have an honest discussion with people. And people are
Yeah.
like,
Right.
oh, just move on. Don't be upset. I'm like, we have been through something. Like when push comes to shove and you actually talk about the real things, people don't want to talk about it here.
Yeah.
And at the time when COVID was happening, people, we couldn't talk to them. That was one of the genius. I'm sure Mussolini's up there in heaven or down there in hell looking at us saying, geez, I should have thought of that. Because we were all separated. We could not amass ourselves. And you know what happened here? The government, so fascist, they created laws. And this isn't under Meloni, by the way. This is under Draghi, the quote unquote liberal candidate.
Yep.
They created laws that said that you can have protests about everything but lockdown, but vaccines. Right. Can you believe that? Right. So we're living in this insane world where people are now going to go and hear a dated blurb from 4 different psychologists and therapists about bullying amongst children. And I'm going to go there and say, I feel bullied. I'm going to play the victim here. I feel bullied that I have to read about. It reminds me of if someone's drowning on the Titanic and someone says, but where are the hors d'oeuvres? I want to talk about the ship sinking, and no one wants to talk about the ship sinking. Now, I know you're a psychiatrist and you might not work with these kind of social paradigms that might be more apropos for psychoanalysis or even in my own field in anthropology, but are you finding this to be par for the course, where the people, especially the people who pushed lockdown, are pretending that they never did and they don't want to talk about any of it?
Yeah, I think what we're dealing here is with a regime in which so many people were complicit for so long, and not only cooperated, but scapegoated and pressured and tried to force compliance on any outliers, anyone who was trying to resist the system. And that has resulted now, I think, in a situation in which you have people with let's say, a conflicted conscience, and they're, first of all, unable or unwilling to look at what happened both to them and by them to other people. And so we're in a situation in which there is a kind of collective denial or a collective wall of psychological defenses that are preventing us from remembering, from looking back over the last 3 years and asking questions. And I think that denial eventually is going to break down, hopefully, as more and more people come out of their kind of hypnotic state or their state of sleepwalking. But that's also going to be a very, very painful process, because it is going to require people to admit that they were wrong, to admit that they were lied to admit that the institutions that they were told to trust and that they did trust, particularly under a state of enforced fear, were actually not trustworthy. So that's a big psychological hill for people to climb, and it's a very painful process. And the easier thing to do, at least in the short term, is simply to look away and to refuse to look outward and to look backward retrospectively in time, and to refuse to look inward and ask, how have I behaved and what have I done, both to myself and to my loved ones and to the people around me over the last 3 years. And so the problem we're facing now is not primarily informational. The information is out there for anyone who cares to look. The problem is, people are directing their attention away from anything that may be difficult for them to accept. And that's something that I think is just going to require ongoing efforts, non-aggressive efforts, to slowly, step by step, bring people out of this kind of sleepwalking state and back into reality. But that's a real challenge. How to do that is going to be a very serious challenge.
There are people with all sorts of psychological and psychiatric disorders. I saw this happening early on. I said, after I realized what was going on and that they were planning to continue this, I said, this is going to be a mental health disaster. And it's not going to be a one generation thing either, right?
That's right. The effects of school closures, the effects on children of the last 3 years are going to take decades to play out. And we're only just, already the evidence of the harms of school closures is mounting in terms of educational development, emotional development, social development. But the full effects of those are going to play out across the lifespan and is going to affect how that generation parents and raises the following generation of children. So yes, the collateral harms, we already have a mountain of evidence for those harms. We have 500 million people, 500 million people, either pushed into poverty during the lockdowns, or if they were already struggling with poverty, pushed deeper into more grinding and more severe poverty, food insecurity, all kinds of not only economic harms, but harms to people's physical and mental health. And I agree that I think we do need a truth and reconciliation model. There was a proposal published in the Atlantic magazine here in the United States the headline was about quote unquote pandemic amnesty. And it was an attempt, I think, just to say, well, there was a lot we didn't know. And, we did the best we could under the circumstances. And, we should all just sort of forgive each other and move on and not get into blaming and not get into, sort of strife over any of this. And the problem with that proposal, I mean, there's several problems, but one of the problems with that proposal is it was a form of sort of cheap forgiveness. I tweeted out that, pandemic amnesty is not actually the establishment, the public health or media establishment, asking for your forgiveness. It's the establishment forgiving themselves, so to speak, and telling you to go away. That's not really reconciliation. That's not really forgiveness. And the truth and reconciliation model shows that the real way forward is actually very difficult and very painful. Because if you look at what happened with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, or the commissions that were formed in Rwanda after the genocide, they began with truth, right? They began with individual people who bore responsibility, standing up and face to face with people who had been harmed or devastated by these actions, admitting the truth of what happened, admitting their role and responsibility in that, and apologizing. And that work is very, very, very hard. And it can lead to real social healing and real social reconciliation. But that has to begin with truth. And so far, we have had none of the truth portion of that proposal. We have had no one stand up and both acknowledge that the policies were harmful and be willing to assume any degree of responsibility for promoting or enforcing those policies. And I think until we begin to have that, it's simply not possible to have the kind of real conversation and real actions that could lead to healing. I mean, one of the other elements of those commissions was, after a genocide, if your family has been murdered, obviously there's no way to make restitution for that. But nevertheless, wherever and whenever possible, attempts at restitution after the apology are necessary, even if they're only symbolic. Money can never bring back my loved one. But, if someone's been injured, for example, by a vaccine, well, they at least deserve to have their medical costs for the treatment of that injury covered. it doesn't mean that their disability is ever going to go away, but it does mean that society, and particularly those responsible for the harms, at least try to whatever extent is possible to make reparation for those harms. So that's actually what's necessary to move forward. But I fear that we're very, very far away from that kind of project moving forward.
Well, that Atlantic piece that you referred to, I grew irate when I saw it for various reasons. Let's start with Jeffrey Goldberg, the editor of The Atlantic, and the fact that that publication has run pro-lockdown pieces quite a bit, has been one of the most intolerant to take pitches from writers. I'm pointing to myself. I've done this with many of the publications. They did not want to talk about psychological harm, even the summer of 2020. And I was one of several journalists. I've talked to a few others. We couldn't get pitches through. No one wanted to talk about it. The leftist publication in Italy, La Repubblica, had titles like The Guardian, like the New York Times, like this: 20 things you can do with your kids during lockdown. And it would involve all these craft items that the poor could not afford.
Right.
The elephant in the, these are leftist papers. And I'll tell you something. I am very, very far left, but I'm revolted by the quote unquote left. I found Fox News more leftist than any of the mainstream media. And I swear, you're looking, you're talking to someone who 20 years ago, I couldn't stand, remember Rush Limbaugh, remember even Tucker Carlson 20 years ago. It was nutty. But he's had the maturity to apologize for ever supporting the global war on terror, for getting it wrong. He has actually stated this. He's more analytic and thoughtful these last 3 years. I've been following them, not every day, but when I can, and thinking about the poor people, thinking about the disenfranchised. I'm really disappointed by what has been discovered from the Twitter files. As you mentioned in your last piece, we are seeing government meddling. Now, when I had Norman Finkelstein on the show a few months ago, he said, well, at least the repression and the censorship we've been put at has come from the hands of big tech. And I said to him, I wouldn't be so sure about that. I think there are fingerprints here of something bigger. I don't think this is a coincidence. And sure enough, can you talk about not just your last piece in the Wall Street Journal, but also your legal case that you have with Louisiana and Missouri, correct?
Yeah, that's right. So there's a case here in federal court called Missouri v. Biden. The state attorney general of Missouri and Louisiana filed this case alleging that several senior people within the executive branch of government and our federal agencies have been colluding with social media companies to censor speech, particularly speech related to critiques of the COVID pandemic policies. And here in the United States, the private companies, arguably companies like Facebook and Meta and YouTube and Twitter and so forth, arguably they can censor and they can decide what they allow on their platforms and what they don't allow on their platforms as private companies. I say there's debate on that because some people think they're not actually private companies; they're more like public utilities. But setting aside that debate, no one doubts that the federal government cannot do that. The federal government cannot engage in that kind of censorship. But the evidence that we've already excavated on discovery in this case, email communications and so forth from the federal government to big tech executives and vice versa, has shown that that's precisely what has been happening. So, and in fact, it's happening on a much vaster scale. And it involves many, many more people and many different federal agencies, at least 17 federal agencies, I think, at last count, than we had even suspected when we first filed the case. And so if the court rules that what we allege is in fact happening, this will be by far the most pervasive and egregious violation of Americans' First Amendment rights in United States history. Full stop. This is and part of that has to do with the technology. I mean, most previous censorship cases that went to the U.S. Supreme Court involve, for example, one book publisher censoring one book at the behest of the government, or censoring, one part of a book. They were sort of one instance things that nevertheless were a serious problem in terms of violating the U.S. Constitution. What we're talking about here involves millions, literally millions of instances of censorship. And the government censorship regime, which involved many, many people literally working around the clock to notify and pressure social media companies to remove content, included, not just flagging certain broad issues, but actually it got to the point where it was so detailed and so down into the weeds that you'd have a government bureaucrat asking a senior executive at a social media company, why hasn't this particular post been removed? Why hasn't this particular individual or account been removed from your platform? So targeting not just sort of, please censor all content criticizing vaccines, but please censor this person's post on such and such a date, such and such a time, that raise questions about the vaccine. So that's what we're dealing with here in the United States. But this case, I think, was the first to begin to break open and allow us to peer under the hood of this censorship regime. What's come out in the Twitter files has only confirmed and reinforced our central claim in the case. And so now we have, from multiple sources, and multiple journalists involved in the Twitter files, and multiple documents that we've retrieved on discovery, all pointing in the same direction of implicating the United States government in the largest violation of Americans' constitutional free speech rights in the history of this country. So this is a big deal, and I'm hoping it's the beginning of the dismantling of this vast censorship regime.
You talk about what happened at your institution, but I blame a lot of this on the media. I really cannot see any other way around it, because where people are getting their information, we already know roughly half of Americans who use Twitter are getting their news feed from there. And when you can control the fact that the Hunter Biden laptop story is not allowed to be shared there, that the New York Post had its account removed for 2 weeks, then Facebook follows in good form, on and on. We're really supposed to believe what we're being told when it turns out all of that was a hoax. And if we go to the New York Times or the Washington Post, these papers of allegedly good repute, they never created erratum. They did not make apologia for their errors, and they made errors.
That's right.
A lot of these papers went along with the lie. The same thing with lockdown, the same thing with not covering mental health deficits, the same thing about masks, something as simple as masks. The lies continue. Here in this country, we have to still wear masks to go to see our doctors. I feel like I'm being given the host and the wine. I'd rather that. I'd rather really have a bottle of wine.
The religious analogy is apt. Health and science were held up as idols. There was a kind of religious fervor that was established around following, people thought they were following the science. They were actually just following the television in most cases. But that created a strong social bond and a sense that I'm among the good people and I'm not among the bad people. And that psychological phenomenon was leveraged to advance certain economic and political aims. And that was instrumentalized for purposes that had nothing to do with public health, nothing to do with the common good. I mean, the whole vaccine argument that you should get it for the sake of others, even if you're not going to benefit, was disingenuous from the beginning, because we knew from the beginning that the vaccines were not tested in the clinical trials as to establish whether they could stop infection and transmission. And it only took about 4 to 6 weeks into the vaccine rollout for us to see that, in fact, they do not stop or slow infection and transmission. And so that argument was that argument on the basis of science was discredited very early on in the mass vaccination campaign, and yet it continued to be deployed. Again, not as a way to advance public health, but as a way to advance social controls.
You're listening to Savage Minds, and we hope you're enjoying the show. Please consider subscribing. We don't accept any money from corporate or commercial sponsors, and we depend upon listeners and readers just like you. Now, back to our show. I tell people, not in severity, but in scale, this is worse than what happened in Nazi Germany. I don't think people realize that we were all locked down. Like, if we had been a refugee from any country, we would have had Amnesty International creating billboards for us. But no, there's a psychological switch that has been flipped here, because we saw a lot of the more woke institutions pushing this madness. I was appalled to see some of the media outlets that I once upon a time respected push this unquestioningly. I understand reporting on that side, but there was never the other side. It was always one side. The monstering of Jay, Martin, everyone who spoke out, not just the Great Barrington Declarants, but anyone who spoke out. It was severe, the kind of monstering that happened to them. People lost jobs. I'm sure you are in good company with Julie Ponesse, who similarly lost her job.
Yeah.
We're talking about academic institutions where our job is to have students think through questions, to question. And we have been now put into a box, put into the naughty corner because of doing just that. What kind of heritage are we leaving the future? I mean, this is dystopian, Erin. And I am not wanting to be Debbie Downer, but I've always been a very positive person. How to put this? I lost my first child in 2007. And when I came out of that, you don't ever survive it in terms of saying, oh, I got over it. No, but you move through this space. I was able to find that space of happiness I once had. I don't find that space of happiness I once had after this, because I find myself living in this, I call it the mental hospital without bars, because I feel like general society is living in denial. If I have to see one more library presentation about Mussolini, or people say to me, well, as soon as she was elected, what do you think about Meloni being elected? And I tell every single person, because they think I'm going to go into some kind of Trump derangement syndrome fit.
Yeah.
And I tell people, we deserve her. I don't think you understand. We deserve her. We deserve much worse. And people don't like my response because I'm practically a Marxist. I mean, I am. But the reality is that nobody had our backs. I have been talking to this group in upstate New York that has been doing rent strikes since lockdown. Nobody thought of renters. But the only country that this has actually been activated and realized in has been New York State, where you've had action. Here in this alleged socialist Europe, nothing. Nobody cared about renters who are on the bottom rung of society, because Italians are one of the highest landowning countries in the world. A huge number of Italians own homes. It's one of the highest. It's certainly in excess of Germany and in England. So when I had to hear the news saying when we could go to our second homes, I wanted to scream. I just thought, this is the priority of this government. People who are uber wealthy, people who need their football fix. Nothing was mentioned about the people doing the relief work, largely women. And it was very disturbing for me, not just because I'm a woman. I could be a man and be seeing right through this because it was transparent. You mentioned the 17 government agencies. 17. This makes McCarthy look like child's play.
Well, clearly what's going on is coordinated. We have the emergence of a new kind of corporatism, the merging of state and corporate power. And if you want to talk about Mussolini, his book with Giovanni Gentile, the definition of fascism, talks about how, in fascism as it actually existed historically, you had this merging of state and corporate power. You had the state commandeering supposedly private corporations for its own ends and its own purposes. So you can have the appearance of a divide between public institutions and private institutions. But in fact, the two, as we see in the United States censorship regime, the two are working hand in glove. And when the private companies try to push back, and there was some pushback from some of the social media companies against the government pressure, the government just keeps at it until the social media companies cave in. And there's a massive asymmetry of power there. These companies are very wealthy. They're obviously very powerful, but the only people more powerful is basically the state, who has the capability to make life difficult for those companies through regulations and other measures. So the kind of corporatism that is emerging today globally, not just in the United States and Italy, but I would argue globally, is the recapitulation of something that happened between the two world wars in Italy, particularly, that we should be very concerned about. I'll mention also, because this whole thing about the libraries, doing a presentation on fascism is so surreal. It almost seems like a propagandistic attempt to divert attention away from the elephant in the room. But Eric Voegelin, who's in academic circles, a well-known 20th century political theorist who studied the 20th century totalitarianisms, had a very interesting insight about totalitarianism. He said the central feature of totalitarian regimes is not secret police or mass surveillance or men in jackboots and concentration camps, as horrifying as all of those things are. And in fact, many of those things we're seeing emerge today: COVID quarantine camps, mass surveillance on a scale that the Nazis and the Italian fascists could only have dreamed of. But he said, as horrifying as all those things are, the central feature of all totalitarian systems is the inability to ask certain questions, the prohibition of questions. The silencing of anyone who sticks their neck out and says, hey, wait a minute, what's going on here? This doesn't make sense. This is not right. And I would respectfully submit that is the most concerning development that we have seen over the last 3 years. Because once you're in a situation in which you're not permitted to ask questions, eventually those strictures on thought and speech become internalized. And this is the distinction, by the way, between a dictatorship and a totalitarian regime. We often use those terms interchangeably, but a dictatorship rules externally through fear. And we certainly saw a lot of that over the last 3 years. But a totalitarian regime will deploy those external threats for a period of time. But as things progress, there is less and less need for secret police and concentration camps and external threats of punishment in order to get people to comply. Because why? Because people psychologically internalize those restrictions. They start reporting on their neighbors. They start self-censoring. And eventually the ultimate prison comes when those questions, the ability to question the society in which I'm living, the ability to question what I've been told, those questions no longer occur to people, right? They've become psychologically impossible. That is the perfection of the totalitarian system. That is the ultimate prison in which people can find themselves. So, people can look around and say, well, we don't have men in jackboots. We don't have secret police. We don't have, concentration camps. I don't know how people could say we don't have mass surveillance, because we do, but it certainly doesn't look like we're living in a totalitarian society externally. But if we're living in a society in which it's become impossible to ask certain questions, to the point where certain questions no longer even occur to people, right? They no longer want to look back and question what happened over the last 3 years. They're no longer interested in asking questions. And when people do raise questions, they get either defensive or angry. Well, they've internalized a system that by Vogelin's definition is totalitarian, and that's a very frightening prospect.
This mirrors much of what Michel Foucault talks about with the panopticon model.
That's right.
Right?
Precisely.
I feel worn down by the fact that our societies are not asking these questions. When I say our societies, I mean just me outside of the school talking to people, waiting for my children to come out. People are in deflection mode. It's really easy to talk about Mussolini, isn't it? Or my mother used to say, other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how was the theater?
Right. Exactly.
Crimes and Misdemeanors, Alan Alda's character saying tragedy plus time is comedy. Akin to that, I would say, yes, people need to step back and have some time to think about it, but we've been locked up. I've worked on issues of suicide bombers, on repression of people in various parts of the world. And here I was. As a journalist, I was no longer in academia. I'm working on this issue. I'm reading all the science. And the fact that it's called the science should include people in. Science is not a singular thing, is it?
Exactly.
And people were so willing to lock into step. And I just, and watching the devastation to my poor 4-year-old child. That's why when I was late, football is our world now. I've told the teachers when they say, oh, your son, he had difficulties coming back to school. And I would tell the teachers, I still do, I don't care if he's illiterate. I want him to be happy. Mm-hmm. Because what we were put through was insane. It was inhuman.
That's right.
The other week, the teachers say, was there something we can do to help? They're at a new school now, near our home. I said, well, yes, there's something you can do. You have unions. Use your unions. Talk to your unions about never locking down again. You need to fight this. This happened not just because of Draghi in Rome. This happened because unions shut up. People weren't speaking. And they said, well, is there something more easy that I could do to help you? Nobody wants to take the work and do it. And it involves sometimes you have to be an asshole because nobody likes the person in the room who agitates. Of course not. Nobody The reason that we see the write-up of the Warsaw Ghetto, the way it happened, people were not happy about the Warsaw uprisings. Of course not. And no one wants people to disturb the status quo, especially when they're actually being exterminated, because that doesn't look good. And nobody wants people to say, Dr. Fauci's, he has conflicts of interest all over the place, as that biography showed, as many others have noticed, as people within the field of research science have been saying for decades before COVID, that there are conflicts of interest all throughout the way that drugs go to trial, the FDA. You work at the FDA because when you retire, guess who you're going to work for? The drug companies you've been approving for 2 decades. We saw this all throughout the OxyContin debates. That happened because of these conflicts of interest. And people want to stick their head in the sand and say, it's over. Enjoy the life. Enjoy the world.
Yeah, enjoy the opiates. I mean, we gave you free porn. And, are there any other palliatives that we can offer that won't treat the underlying disease, but will sort of placate the masses? And this is another feature of totalitarian systems. I mean, Brave New World, Aldous Huxley's famous dystopian novel, featured a kind of soft totalitarianism that, you can contrast that with Orwell's 1984, which did have the Big Brother, the secret police, the surveillance, the men in jackboots. And in Huxley's dystopian world, the masses were sort of kept in line and kept in a sort of passive state. They were this homogenous, passive, uniform mass that was easily manipulated, in part because the ubiquitous use of the fictionalized drug soma, right? Anytime you have an unpleasant thought or feeling, anytime anyone starts asking questions or starts wondering about the meaning and purpose of their life, or what is all of this about, well, you just pop a few soma pills, or you just, download a bit of porn, or you just you just plug into 24/7 sports. Then these questions will these unpleasant questions will eventually sort of disappear. And I think what we're seeing now is a kind of blending of the future that Orwell saw with the future that Huxley saw. We had the kind of soft totalitarianism of Huxley probably leading up to the pandemic, and then was added to that over the last 3 years, what I call the biomedical security state, this increasingly militarized public health apparatus, the digital technologies of surveillance and control, all of this backed up by the police power of the state, the more Orwellian vision of totalitarian dystopia. And so I think, both of these novels in their own prophetic way saw at least partially the future that was coming. And now we seem to be living in that future. My recent book, The New Abnormal, I was doing another interview about the book, and the interviewer said, reading your book felt like reading nonfiction Orwell. And what I told him was, look, I didn't set out to write nonfiction Orwell. I set out just to explain what's going on. I set out, first of all, to figure out what happened to me professionally and why the biomedical security regime basically came down on me when I started asking questions and forced me out of academic medicine. And to answer that question, I realized I had to go beyond questions of public health and look at these broader issues. And the truth right now is going to be unpalatable to a lot of people, but it's better to live in reality, however uncomfortable that reality might be, than to live in a permanent, drugged out, gorked out, soma-induced coma. Because the truth is better than a lie, even if the truth at times is difficult or painful.
There were huge numbers of corporations behind the corporations. There were the puppeteers of companies such as Facebook and Twitter that make Meta look like small fish. There are huge corporations that were signing on to an agreement to keep us locked up. These companies were all in it together. And it's really frightening when you start to look at what was happening.
COVID saw the largest upward transfer of wealth in world history from the working class and the middle class. Correction, not COVID. The lockdowns, our policy response to COVID, resulted in the largest upward transfer of wealth in world history. From the working class and the middle class, not just the upper class, but to the very tip of the socioeconomic pyramid, to the largest, wealthiest multinational corporations in the world, mostly big tech. The personal wealth of their CEOs skyrocketed during the pandemic, and their stock prices skyrocketed. Again, I need to keep correcting myself. Not during the pandemic, during the lockdowns, because of our policy response to the pandemic. And so Amazon in the United States lobbied, for example, on the West Coast of the US for lockdowns very early on. Why was that? Was that because Jeff Bezos is an expert on how to manage respiratory viruses or to deal with public health? No, it's because when people were locked down in their homes, first of all, Amazon's competition, the small businesses, closed, and only 40% of those small businesses that closed in 2020 during lockdowns have still not reopened. So the lockdowns destroyed big tech's competition in the market. And when people were forced to interact only behind screens and unable to go out of their home, of course, they were going to be ordering all of their goods online. They were going to be engaged in all of their communications online, which was precisely the perfect business model for social media and big tech and Google to basically take their already enormous profits and see them skyrocket. And so that's why I say there are economic and political interests at work. They really have nothing to do with public health. And given that those same social media companies, particularly when people are locked down and unable to interact face to face at work or at school, those social media companies have enormous power to control the flow of information and the flow of communications. One of the censorship regime discoveries that we made in our Missouri v. Biden case was Meta, which is the parent company that owns Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp, was censoring not only on Facebook and Instagram COVID-related information, they were censoring on WhatsApp. Now, WhatsApp is a supposedly secure end-to-end encrypted text messaging application. So when people use WhatsApp, they believe that I'm just using this application to text message my family and friends, and it's maybe cheaper than doing an SMS message, but it's more or less the same thing. Well, so how did Facebook, or Meta rather, manage to censor content on WhatsApp? Well, they would limit the kinds of links that you could share. And so while they may not be able to directly access the content of your message, they can see if you've attached a link to an article or to a news story or to a video. And if they didn't like that thing that you were sharing, they would limit the number of times it could be shared. They would limit the number of people with whom it could be shared. So again, controlling the flow of information through censorship, reaching into not just the stuff that I think I'm posting publicly on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram, but even the things that I think I'm sharing privately on applications like WhatsApp. This is a level of surveillance and control and information control and propaganda that would have been impossible 20 years ago because the technology simply was not available, but was made possible basically after 2007, which is when the first iPhone was released. So this was the first kind of public health crisis or epidemic or pandemic of the digital age. And we saw that various governmental and private actors were prepared to use those tools at their disposal precisely for the purpose of surveillance and control of entire populations.
I've had guests on the show who talked about the power of the World Economic Forum. Yeah. And you start to look at the list of these major companies that make, like you said, Meta, it owns other companies that are in themselves big. Oh my gosh. You've got some mega companies here, and a lot of them are chemical, life insurance, and investment companies. Mitsubishi Chemical Group, Mohammed bin Salman Foundation, Monaco Economic Board, Morgan Lewis, Morgan Stanley, Mozilla. You go through their alphabet. It's depressing. McDonald's, the Mayo Clinic, McKinsey Company. There are conflicts of interest up and down this because what you have is one person scratching the back of the other who scratches and on and on and on.
Well, there are credible arguments out there that COVID was used opportunistically to basically orchestrate, how to put this? People in finance could see disaster brewing in 2019, and they could see a major global crisis brewing in 2019. And they could see the very real and probably inevitable danger of global economic collapse occurring before the pandemic. And many of these most powerful financial actors, these world-spanning corporations, were probably happy to use COVID not only as an excuse to vacuum up wealth from the lower classes, the middle classes, but also as a distraction or a plausible sort of deniability scenario for why the economic collapse occurred. right? We can blame it on the virus. We can blame it on a global pandemic rather than blaming it on uh, the irresponsible and massive leveraging of debt and leveraging of debt and the printing of money and the artificially low interest rates and all the other mechanisms that were used to delay the inevitable collapse. And I'm not an economist. I'm not an expert in macroeconomics. So I don't know that I have the expertise to actually weigh in on that theory. But based on what I've seen and based on my layman's understanding of what was at work globally economically, it does seem like at the very least, it does seem like a plausible hypothesis.
Yes, I can't see how this was accidental. And there were cases in the States where smaller businesses were not allowed to be open in certain states, but the Walmarts were.
Right. There
There's
you go.
no other way to
Just
read
so.
that. It's
Yeah.
not a coincidence that, if anything, if you're going to talk about level of hygiene and danger, it's far easier to control who's going in and out of a small shop than Walmart, where people are just running around and aisles
Precisely.
are open.
Yeah.
No, I found the way that we've been lied to traumatizing. That's why I'm going to be Debbie Downer for a while. I think I'm going to be Debbie Downer here until we get a Truth and Reconciliation Committee going.
Yeah.
And I, as an immigrant, could not just go out on the streets and protest. But as soon as I get my citizenship, I hope to be arrested the next lockdown, because this is insane what's gone on.
Yeah, no, civil disobedience is the only way forward here. And what I've been trying to explain to people is, even though many of these specific policies have been walked back in particular regions, some places no longer have clearly lockdowns. Some places have dropped their vaccine mandates. Nevertheless, that whole infrastructure that I described earlier, that biomedical security state infrastructure that allowed all this to happen, is still in place, just waiting for the next declared state of emergency to advance its aims even further. So COVID was just the beginning. And the people, the people who advanced their aims during COVID are ready to continue advancing their aims with the next real or manufactured public health crisis. And we have to be ready for that. And we have to know, where are we going to draw the line and how are we going to collectively stand up and resist? Because if we don't, we're only going to see the continued erosion of our freedoms and human rights.
I am very worried about the zeitgeist at this point, because when I interviewed Jay the second time a few months ago, he thanked me. He said, "Oh, I want to thank you for having me on the show because you were one of the first journalists that interviewed me." And
Yeah.
I was like, "Well, thank you, because I feel like you saved my life." Like, I could not, but aside from the obvious fact that during lockdown we were in prison, so we couldn't see the other inmates. Very
Yeah.
strange prison this was. At least in a real
That's
prison, you
right.
get to see them during lunch, right? Anyways, I felt like I had nobody to talk to, because I'm in the country of a future psychological crisis. I do not
Right.
believe that a country where people are so oblivious to what has happened, while at the same time Italians are, oh, that child, the UNICEF calendars every Christmas. I always have to say, no,
Right.
you gotta stop doing
Right.
that, because I'm very critical of the NGO, and I'm very critical of a lot of what goes on around development work. And so I see these people as being very willing to follow whatever mandate they're given, and they drive around smiling with their masks on. I'm imagining I can see their smiles because their masks on, but they're driving in their cars alone with masks on to virtue signal their goodness. And this happens
Yeah.
today. I saw it today. I see it all the time. I understand the elderly wearing the masks in the shops. I do. They've been frightened to death.
That's right.
I get that. And I actually am angry about it, because you'd think someone would say on the news that oxygen levels are important and maybe, but no, not happening. Everyone now has their porn and their football and their second houses. But
Yep.
it's made me feel really down about the world, about where in the heck am I? Because I've had a lot of people and some of our readers and listeners who early on, even before I launched Savage Minds, I launched it in 2020, but people would say, well, you've changed your position. I've changed my position because I change with new information. This is not the
Right.
plague. We've been lied to. Let's accept that we've been lied to and let's move on. But what about what do you mean? What about? We've got to talk about the one thing we have is, yes, our health. People always say that you have your health. That's the most important thing. Mental health is health too. That's been thrown to the side. No one's talking about this. A life of depression is not a life I want. A life
That's
of
right.
seeing my children being unable to express themselves because they're angry because of what happened is not a life I want to see for anyone, not my children only, but anyone's children.
Right.
We kept hearing about how the children suffered. I know people in my age range have suffered. A lot of people my age have suffered. People are like
Right.
freaking out. I know friends who are leftists who moved to Florida State just to never have to live through that again. And that's crazy to me.
Well, look, I would like to maybe try to offer our listeners a little bit of hope because I agree with you. Things are bad, and we have to be honest about where we're at, and what's going on. But I do also want to point out, as a friend of mine likes to say, nature, and particularly human nature, always bats in the bottom of the ninth inning, and that's an American metaphor referring to baseball. So, for people who don't follow baseball, ninth inning is the end of the game. It's sort of the last chance to turn things around for the losing team, and I think what my friend means by that, and I agree with him, is that, well, two things. Number one, regimes that are built on lies will always eventually collapse under the weight of their own internal contradictions. That's the good news. The bad news is that they can be propped up for a long time by structures of power. So, Stalin's Soviet regime lasted a long time and destroyed many people's lives. And so eventually it collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions, but it took a long time and there was a lot of damage done. So I think the task for us is, first of all, to recognize that the present darkness will end, and the regime supporting it eventually will collapse. And the only question then is, how do we accelerate that process? And I think we accelerate that process by continuing to do what you're doing, by patiently and persistently having these conversations, talking to people, asking questions, taking them maybe the next step up that inclined plane out of ignorance and into an awareness of what's going on around them. And so it's not a question of whether the current biosecurity global technocracy will collapse. It will. And we're starting to see cracks in the edifice of this mega machine. We're starting to see things opening up. We're starting to see more and more people asking questions. It's become more and more possible to have these conversations today than it was even 6 months ago. The censorship on Twitter has loosened up, and that's broken open a lot of stories. That's allowed a lot of people who have been asking questions to gain more and more reach. The largest Twitter spaces recently have been those that are devoted to COVID and vaccine mandates and these topics. So people are actually hungry to finally be able to talk about this. Not everyone, but a significant portion of the population. And the fact is, we don't need to wake everyone up. We just need to wake up a sufficiently critical mass, a powerful minority that begins chipping away at this edifice. And then we're going to reach a tipping point. I mean, nobody saw in 1988 Soviet communism and its satellite states collapse. No one predicted that the Berlin Wall would fall a year before it fell. In fact, most observers of the world scene thought that, the East-West Cold War is sort of a permanent feature of our political landscape. It's not going to change anytime soon. And we have to sort of learn to live with it. But history is full of surprises, and it's something in 1989 reached a tipping point, and suddenly the regime collapsed, and it collapsed without a shot being fired, which was also shocking, right? Most observers thought, well, the only way the Cold War is going to end is, with a large scale nuclear war, right? Or this kind of continued stalemate indefinitely. But that's not, in fact, what happened. That regime collapsed under the weight of its own internal contradictions, and so I do want to offer people a sense of hope that lies and propaganda and censorship and all the rest can seem very powerful, but the people propping this up are having to work so hard precisely because the truth is powerful. And the truth can lead to a crisis, an internal crisis of a regime that is built on lies. And so patiently, peacefully, calmly, but firmly, and with conviction, continuing to speak the truth, I think is more powerful than people realize. People have internalized some of these constrictions on their own thought and speech. Stop self-censoring. This is something ordinary people can do. Your listeners may wonder, well, gosh, this thing is so powerful. And, I don't have a microphone like the people on the show that can reach lots of people. I just have my own little life here and my own small circle of influence. Well, begin there. And those small acts of saying, I'm not going to self-censor. I'm going to say what I think in this circumstance. That's contagious. Cowardice is contagious, as we saw in 2020. But courage is also contagious. And maybe you stepping out and saying, no, I don't actually think what happened to us was okay. And I don't think the lockdowns made any sense. And in fact, they did a lot of harm. Well, that may empower 2 or 3 other people in that conversation, at your school or at your workplace, to step out and say, I agree. People who otherwise would have stayed silent, but because you were willing to speak up, that gave them the courage to speak up. So I think we need to take heart, first of all, that this regime will collapse, but second of all, that ordinary people have a role in that, and ordinary people can do. We all need to do our part, and if we start doing that, if even 5 or 10% of the population starts doing that, that will be the beginning of the end of the kinds of problems that we've talked about on the show.
I only hope that people will think more proactively also about their role in the world, because aside from this subject, I remember many years ago talking about a subject, I don't remember what, and the person's response to me was, "Oh, I'm not political." And I looked at her and I said, "You are. You just don't know you are." Everything is political in our day and age.
Right. That's right.
The fact that you're drinking bottled water and talking to me, that's a political choice you took. And she was a bit annoyed by my response. But I think it's time that people understand that this happened because we allowed it to happen. And when I say we had to be a mass in order to turn that ship around. And we didn't. We didn't for various reasons. Your book on the new abnormal, the rise of the biomedical security state, addresses a lot of these issues that we've discussed. Is there a takeaway from that book that might give those in power hesitation? Should they be the new Fauci? Because I say this,
Yeah.
because here we were given Fauci. It was almost like, why did anyone vote in elections in all these different countries if at the end of the day, the big brother Fauci was going to be on the screen? There
Yeah.
were cues being taken directly from the White House or from his office, just in the same ironic way. I'm sure you've been doing this these last weeks. Have you seen CNN's coverage of China's lockdown? And it's
Yeah.
so bad. It's so,
Yeah.
and I'm thinking, where were you
Wait
2
a
years
minute.
ago?
Exactly. Exactly. Exactly.
Two different
Okay,
yardsticks there.
they're a 10 out of 10 on a bad scale, but gosh, we were at 8 out of 10 on a bad scale just a few years ago. Yeah, exactly. Where were you? But but that's also a first kind of little trial balloon, a first foray into the realm of truth for CNN. So, yeah, I mean, it's part of me wants to call out their hypocrisy. But another part of me says, well, okay, that's a start. If that's the only step that they can take at this point is, criticizing the Chinese Communist regime, which is where lockdowns originated. Well, okay, I'll take that over the radio silence on lockdowns that we've seen from CNN throughout this whole crisis. So I'm really trying to find the positive here, Julian. Sometimes it's hard, but I think we need to. Yeah, we can't lose hope. We can't lose hope.
True. Although Jay said, I resemble his wife in terms of I want heads to roll, and he's more
Yeah.
sympathetic. I'm not. I'm not. And again, I'm a very sympathetic person about so many issues. If I can fight for the rights of someone on death row, but there's a difference. Uh, there's a big difference. And this is where I go back to, if your book offers some kind of light in the scientific medical field, in the same way that there needs to be a book about the new abnormal written about my colleagues who pushed lies. I referred to the editor of The Atlantic earlier. The Atlantic is one of those publications that I would never work for, ever, because of his presence there. This is a person who brought us the global war on terror based on lies, along with Judith Miller. This is someone who was promoted for his work in creating the disillusion of a state of what many consider to be mass murder and leading to domino effect in many ways, Syria, which huge human rights crisis and one of the biggest since the Holocaust on the scale of, in numbers, people being displaced. It's disgusting. For me, that publication is toilet paper. But the fact that they ran that piece, what she wanted us to do was to forget about the complicity. Now, I'm all into people not having their heads roll and just being able to say, we screwed up. Let's have this the next time something similar goes down. And that's not what that writer was proposing. She was proposing that we all just look the other way and accept, it was a bad day. It was a bad hair day. And that pissed me off. I was so angry about that piece, Aaron. I was so angry that I started to write about it and I couldn't. I was that angry.
There has to be both a reckoning and a better way than just having our head explode because of this. The pent-up anger is understandable. I felt it at times. Absolutely, I felt it at times. But the problem is, I think that kind of reaction, that kind of approach, plays into the hands of those who have weaponized media and communications and good intentions for so long, that any aggression or violence, even if only sort of verbal aggression, I think will be met with more retaliation and more excuses for increasing tyrannical controls and censorship. Look at all these unhinged COVID skeptics that are, saying these crazy things. We need to, this little Twitter's little experiment in free speech has obviously failed. We need to get these people off of our platforms. So that's why I think, and Matthias Desmond, when he talks about mass formation, has written about this. That's why the response, as hard as this is to do, has to be the nonviolent resistance response of a Gandhi or a Martin Luther King Jr., which is a heroic level of self-restraint in the face of aggression and tyranny. But it's also, for that very reason, I think, enormously powerful.